Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you. Um, uh, since this is a recorded video, I'll introduce myself. My name is Janer Dali. Today, I'm going to be speaking with you about some themes from a book of mine which has recently come out, the title of which you can see here, Metaphysical Institutions, Islam and the Modern Project. Now, this book, which looks like this book has three main parts. Uh, the first part is a discussion of the question of conceptualizing Islam and specifically being able to conceptualize Islam as a metaphysical institution. And so we're going to be talking, and so that section deals with the concepts of religion, tradition, civilization, um, and culture. And then I develop a new theory of the institution and supplement it, you might say, or add to that concept the idea of a metaphysical institution. That's going to be mostly what I'm going to be talking about with you in this particular lecture. Um, the other two parts of the book, the second part of the book, is related closely to the first, and it extends the discussion to speaking about metaphysics proper, and specifically the nature of consciousness when consciousness is shared amongst individuals in this reality that I'm sometimes referred to in the book as shared thinking, the space within which institutions exist. And then finally, uh, you have the historical encounter between Islam as a metaphysical institution and the modern project as a metaphysical institution. And we'll speak a little bit about that in the lecture today. But just to give a sense that the book has many themes, the work has many themes, but what I'm going to try to cover today relates more to the first part of the book, which is um, motivated, you might say, or had its seed in the question of this notion of conceptualizing Islam, which is such an important theme within the humanities and social sciences. And in fact, that is where the book began. I began research on really what was supposed to be an article, a kind of a survey of some of the reactions to a book that had come out back in 2015 or 2016, I should say, called What is Islam by Shahab Ahmed, which itself was a kind of a discussion and survey of other works related to this question, what is Islam or what makes something Islamic? And I found that as I approached trying to discuss this work, but also the responses to it, because it had generated so much discussion at the time, I found that the article grew into two articles, and then ultimately it grew into a small book and then into a full monograph. And I realized that in order to be able to answer a question like what is Islam or what is Islamic, and to be able to really approach the question with any kind of theoretical rigor, one really needed to get to the philosophical questions that really the what is Islam question is really just one particular instance of. So let's just jump right into it and begin to speak about what some of these issues are and understand how it is that what is Islam is really a general, or let's say it really helps to illuminate a general philosophical set of questions. All right. So when you first begin to look into the literature about this, in the academic literature specifically, I mean, you begin to see that in almost all cases, one of these four terms will wind up being part of the definition or the conceptualization, whether that conceptualization of Islam is formal or informal. One of these four terms will be primary, will be a kind of an ultimate term in the definition. And those four terms, as you can see, are religion, culture, civilization, and tradition. That is to say, when someone tries to tell you what Islam is, before they say anything else, it's going to be slotted into one of these categories. Um, Now, what that implies is that one's understanding of each of these concepts, whether it's religion, culture, civilization, or tradition, that the assumption or the implication is that one's understanding of these concepts is strong enough and is clear enough, unambiguous enough, right? That these concepts are unambiguous enough to be able to shed light on this concept. But then when you begin to look for formal treatments of these terms within the scholarly literature, as to say, when you start trying to um, ask not what is Islam, but in this case, what is religion? What is culture? What is civilization? What is tradition? You begin to run into a strange situation where scholarship has not been able to establish an agreed upon sense of what the subject matter even is. So you have people who study religion professionally, who study culture professionally, religious studies scholars, anthropologists, historians who study civilization, sociologists as well. Tradition is a little bit of a different case, which we're going to come to. Um, and even though when people want to name their most ultimate sense of belonging, these are not secondary terms. These are really important terms, not only in everyday language, but also in scholarship. These are the ideas that people reach for, the ultimate sense of we, right? This ultimate sense of belonging, the ultimate sense of wisdom and maturity. But it turns out that for a half century and sometimes even a century or more, that these terms have not really gone far beyond the level of I know it when I see it, even in academic scholarship. That is to say, um, when you when a given scholar or a given, let's say, theorist wants to slot or categorize a given idea or practice or what have you as being either culture or religion, um, uh, it really relies upon the intuition or the, you might say, the pre-existing knowledge, the presuppositions of the scholar or researcher, and never comes about as a result of a well-crafted concept or theory. And we're going to come to this. So let's look a little bit at the, excuse me, the history of some of these ideas. So if we look at the question of defining religion, uh, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, one of the luminaries, one of the biggest names in the history of religious studies, said in 1962, the dates here are important to keep in mind, said there have been, in recent decades, a bewildering variety of definitions, and none have commanded wide acceptance. So in 1962, he's writing about the previous decades. But then in 2013, Brent Nungbury writes, scholars have had and continue to have an extremely difficult time agreeing on a definition of religion. Another scholar who's written one of the most commonly used textbooks in the field, I won't read this whole quote, but he said it's fair to say that no single theory in religious studies exercises an influence comparable to the leading perspectives half a century ago. He speaks of them as being centers of theoretical interest or paths of inquiry, meaning there's no really one agreed upon theory that one can use to study this thing called religion. There's just different ways, or you might say preferences, that different scholars have for approaching the subject matter. What about culture? What about this notion of culture? Well, if we go as far back as 1947, this book called Culture, A Critical Review of Concepts and Definitions by Kroeber and Kluckhohn actually looked at 164 definitions of culture. Now, some of these were not full conceptualization. Some of them were kind of pithy and brief. But anyway, they comprehensively looked at it. And recall that this is in the 40s, and they're looking back on the previous decades. And what they say it needs a little bit of unpacking, but what they say is we have no theory of culture. We have a fairly well delineated concept, and it is impossible to enumerate conceptual elements embraced within that master concept. And it is possible, not impossible. But a concept, even an important one, does not constitute a theory. In anthropology at present, we have plenty of definitions, but too little theory. Now, essentially what that means is uh, I interpret them as saying that, anthropologists know what they mean by culture. Um, they have plenty of ways of characterizing it in a kind of idiomatic fashion, but there's no real theoretical rigor behind their definitions. But then when we fast forward to the 90s, we have a statement saying that despite a century of efforts to define culture adequately, um, by the 90s, this is written in 2012, there was no agreement among anthropologists regarding its nature. All right, so what if we look at the term civilization? If we look back at a work written, here the date is 1995, but actually this is back in, I believe, 62, if not earlier. Fernand Braudel writes, it would be pleasant, um, in a book entitled The History of Civilizations, it would be pleasant to be able to define the word civilization simply and precisely, as one defines a straight line, et cetera, et cetera. The vocabulary of the social sciences, unfortunately, scarcely permits decisive definitions. And he goes on to say that we really shouldn't worry too much about the fact that we don't have a agreed upon definition of civilization. Um, Later, we have a situation where there are dozens, if not hundreds, of definitions of civilization around. And the author of this article says, I am told by the members of the International Society for the Comparative Study of Civilizations that they've actually attempted in various meetings to come up with a consensus definition with no success. And here, this is actually a quote from Samuel Huntington, who is probably familiar to many people. His name is very closely associated with this notion of civilization. And even though he does offer his own, I'm not going to be getting into it today, but he does offer his own, not, I wouldn't say conceptualization, but his own sort of sense of what a civilization is. But even he remarks, looking at past scholarship, that in some of the more important resources about this subject, there's no article, for example, on civilization or civilizations in the encyclopedia that he's looking at. And in fact, even if when you look at his own first his article, then his book on the clash of civilizations, there's not really a coherent concept. There's, in a sense, multiple expressions of his own intuitions about what a civilization is, um, plus some other remarks, but nothing incredibly coherent. I can't really talk much about that because of time, but it's something worth mentioning, and I do discuss it in the book. What about the question of tradition? Um, Tradition is, generally speaking, not very, is sort of ignored as a formal concept within scholarship. There are some scholars who are exceptions to this. Edward Shills wrote a book called Tradition, which was published in 1981, where this quote is drawn from. And he says about a social scientist, avoid the confrontation with tradition. And in other words, and they essentially take tradition and they break it up into different concepts. And it's, as in his words, traditionality, to use his concept, as a property of beliefs and actions and institutions, is dissolved into other things. And even other scholars like the philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer, Jaroslav Pelikan, those two names especially, they do talk about tradition quite a lot, but they don't offer what you might call a formal definition of it. They simply assume the kind of idiomatic sense of it, and they have this kind of I know it when I see it, but they don't really set out to conceptualize tradition or to define it in their works. Now, so we're looking at these as, again, coming back to that initial idea. One wants to say something about what Islam is. What is Islam? And then the terms that are most ultimate and important for pointing to and saying what Islam is, in other words, what kind of thing is Islam? What kind of thing is Islam? It's usually replied to in terms of tradition, culture, civilization, religion, and very often a combination of these. And so, for example, if we begin concretely, if we begin not from general concepts, but from particulars, this is just a very sort of funny list of various items that a scholar in anthropology and sociology, history, religious studies might look at and they might be interested in saying, is such and such a thing Islamic, or how is it Islamic? Whether it's intellectual works or social practices, um, concrete, you might say, material items, uh, different people of various kinds. You can multiply this list and have it cover, hundreds of pages and thousands of pages. These kind of particular things that scholars are interested in when they're asking the question about whether such and such a thing is Islamic or not. Now, if one were to look at this question uh, using a Venn diagram, this diagram, what I'm trying to accomplish here is to say, um, uh, if you look at things which are potentially Islamic, you might say, law or art, coffee, ethics, streetlights, prophethood, these kind of items. There's a way in which scholars are going to classify these things into one category or another. So I drew some of the items from this list, and this is to show, you might say, the way in which scholars would taxonomize, or what categories they would put these things into. So I think there would be unanimity among scholars looking at this subject matter that prophethood would unambiguously be not part of culture or civilization, but of religion only. And that if you were to look at lullabies, it would be within the cultural category. And the same thing for, let's say, ship making. You would call this part of Islamic civilization, or just in the category of civilization itself. And unambiguously, not very few people, if any, would say that ship making is part of culture or religion. Although even there you can make an argument. Then there are some things which fit, depending on the scholar you ask. Some will say it goes into the religious category, and some will say into the civilization category, like law, or into both, or carpet weaving in the case of culture and civilization, or ethics here. And then there are some things, for example, art, which fit into any of these categories, depending on the perspective, or depending on the item that you're talking about, or depending on the style of art and what have you. It can be cultural, it can be religious, it could be something that could be characterized as civilizational. Now, what's important about a diagram like this, or even a set of definitions about what makes something religious or cultural or civilizational, is that it can never offer a way of categorizing new items into one or the other categories. All that you can do with something like this is a kind of a snapshot. It's a kind of a portrait it's a reflection of the intuitions or of the presuppositions of the scholars who are looking at this subject matter. In other words, there's no diagram or set of definitions that enable us really to be able to look at a given practice or an idea or a thing or a person and to say, well, this is religious, this is cultural, and this is civilization, based upon a kind of an algorithm or formalism. Rather, what really actually tends to happen is that we tend to know already what we think counts as religion, or what already counts as culture, what already counts as civilization. And then we take the items as they come and we sort of put them into those boxes, you might say. And then we might come up with a justification as to why that's the case. But what we don't have is what I'm calling analytical or theoretical concepts. That is to say, we have a folk sense of what civilization means. We have a folk sense or idiomatic sense of what culture means, what these four terms mean. Um, now, these are not empty terms. That's not what I'm trying to say. They're folk terms, but they're extremely rich folk terms. They're extremely even sophisticated, rich, and meaningful folk terms, but they don't rise to the level of theoretical or analytical concepts. That is to say, they don't enable us to be able to shed further light on other concepts. So we have a rich sense of what civilization is, or what culture is. But using these terms in order to be able to say what Islam is, or what something that is potentially Islamic is, they don't enable us to do that, because we don't have a definition or a concept that's unambiguous enough to be able to shed further light on another concept. So the first point here is that a lack of formal definition for important ideas is not necessarily wrong. And in fact, this is very often what we have. scholars who deal with a given subject matter are often very erudite, very sophisticated about what they're doing, but when pushed to give precise definitions for some of their important terms, often can't do it. And this doesn't mean that they're not doing scholarship. And definitions, however, if you're going to conceptualize Islam, but they're only as good as their most ambiguous terms. And my claim here is that these terms of culture, civilization, religion, and tradition, which are used to be able to say what Islam is and to evaluate what Islam is, remain folk concepts, right? And that the existing definitions that we do have, that is to say, the existing conceptualizations that we have, really fail to exclude or include on their own, but they get changed on an ad hoc basis based upon the scholar's own views. And what I mean by that is you run into something that is sometimes in the field of science is called the demarcation problem. That is to say, being able to set up a definition that includes the thing that you want to include, while also at the same time excluding all of the things that you want to exclude. And this is something that you don't have in the case of these four ideas. Okay, so what do we do about this? Well, one of the things that you can do is to try to establish and you might say establish a larger concept within which these four large concepts, right, these four ideas of civilization, culture, tradition, and religion fit. And what the book does is to say that institution, right, that these are all different kinds of institution, and specifically what I'm calling metaphysical institutions. But even before we get to this idea of metaphysical institution, we have to, that's actually quite interesting. You have to get into the question of defining institutions themselves, because it turns out, and this was actually surprising to me, that that this idea of an institution is not as well defined in the literature as one might have expected. So, for example, here we have some quotes. Institutions are as mysterious as they are ubiquitous. And there's many different approaches. There's still unclarity about what exactly an institution is. The definitions abound. All right, none of them have become firmly institutionalized, which is a little bit recursive there, but I think you get the meaning. And then others who say that there's some scholars who say that the idea of an institution is overly ambiguous and lacking it's not really suitable as a construct for research. Now, I think institution still is clear enough. It does get us into more or less into the right area of concern. I'm going to return to that in a second. But why metaphysical? What is this? Why is an institution metaphysical, or how can it be metaphysical? Well, it's worth remembering that there are different kinds of institutions that generally speaking are acknowledged within the literature. So the political, legal, economic, familial, and then religious in a certain limited sense. It's a somewhat more narrow than this notion of metaphysical institution as I'm speaking here. You might say it's one kind of metaphysical institution. And I think actually it's very justified to categorize these four as kinds of institutions, because I'm certainly not the first to do so. So, for example, Karl Popper spoke of traditions and institutions as being strikingly similar, right? As being almost synonymous in some cases. Toynbee, the historian of civilization, said that he spoke of civilizations as being institutions of the highest order. That is to say, the institutions that comprehend without being comprehended, right? So the ultimate institution. Sir Hamilton Gibb, one of the most prominent Orientalists of Islamic studies from the 20th century, he used the word institution in this way. He spoke of the Islamic religious institution as compared to Persian or Arab social traditions, and also talked about, you might say, sub-institutions, for the Shias and the Sunnis and the Sufis. And so what we mean by metaphysics here, and what makes these institutions metaphysical, is that it's not that they're metaphysical in some sense, like the way that a transcendent reality is metaphysical, but these institutions are metaphysical in the same way that you can say that natural sciences are natural. That is to say, it concerns the metaphysical. It concerns ultimate questions of what is real, what is possible, and what is good. We're talking here about the domain of first principles, of ultimate presuppositions. And so when you talk about, political institution, legal institution, right? These are institutions related to the areas of life, of politics, of law, of economics, and so forth. And then, of course, what are the institutions that deal with human beings existing in this institutional reality, this reality of sharing thinking in a certain kind of way? To follow the pattern, we call them metaphysical institutions, right? So when we talk about our culture, our civilization, these turn out to be, if you actually look at the way these words are used, different modalities of referring to this ultimate level of institutional reality, into that kind of space, but there's really not a name for them. Because the words that we use to refer to this actually become um, they become deployed depending on what the speaker means. You speak about this, your metaphysical institution, as religion here, sometimes as culture, sometimes as civilization, sometimes as tradition. But this use turns out to be very contingent upon the presuppositions of the person who's saying that. And that's why, one of the reasons why we need to have a kind of uh, a better theoretical rubric to be able to analyze these ideas. So what are some specific definitional shortcomings when we look at some of the ways that people have talked about these realities? What goes wrong? Well, in some cases, these definitions are a little bit too simple, and sometimes even something like they're poetic. When people talk about many of the definitions of culture, for example, that are in that survey of the book that I mentioned earlier, are sometimes maybe a sentence long. Um, uh, uh, right? And so those can be correct from the point of view of the scholar, but they don't do much work that's synthetic or analytical in terms of being able to then take that and apply it to new realities. They're an expression of a kind of a simple sentiment on the part of the scholar. Secondly, they're poorly demarcated, and here what I'm talking about is the terms of the definition themselves. We're going to talk about this in a second. Um, where does the concept begin and end, and how are the terms of the definition distinguished from each other internally? And then finally, this kind of hodgepodge or kitchen sink definitions. In other words, long, sometimes a paragraph or two or three that essentially are laundry lists of what the scholar who's doing the theorizing thinks belong in that category. And these are shortcomings because they don't give us analytical power. They don't allow us to take the rubric and then apply it to new cases. They only really register what the scholar himself or herself have been talking about. So let me give you an example of this. We have a pretty well-known definition by Clifford Geertz of religion from 1966, where he says, it's a system of symbols which acts to establish powerful, pervasive, and long-lasting moods and motivations in men by formulating conceptions of a general order of existence and clothing these conceptions with such an aura of factuality that the moods and motivations seem uniquely realistic. Now, in response to this, the scholar Bruce Lincoln offers another conceptualization. It says it's a discourse whose concerns transcend the human, temporal, and contingent, and claims for itself a similarly transcendent status, a set of practices whose goal is to produce a proper world and or proper human subjects as defined by a religious discourse to which these practices are connected. It's a community whose members construct their identity with a reference to a religious discourse and its attendant practices, and an institution that regulates religious discourse practices and community, reproducing them over time and modifying them as necessary while asserting their internal validity and transcendent value. Now, as I said, one of the difficulties here is the question of ambiguity, right? Or of demarcation, or of the distinctness of the terms of the definition. So if we look back at some of these terms, I didn't give this, but there's a very famous definition of culture by Tyler, which includes items like custom and belief and knowledge and morals. Where exactly does a custom end and belief begin? Or how is knowledge specifically separated from morals? Or in the case of Geertz, what's the difference between a mood and an aura, or between a symbol and a conception? Sometimes symbol and conception can be synonymous, and sometimes they're different. What's the difference between an institution and a community, or between a discourse and a practice? So these can be distinct or they can overlap. But I think in many cases, our knowledge of these terms, our sense of what these terms mean, is already folk knowledge itself. And so we're using ambiguous ideas in order to define what is supposed to be something. We're trying to disambiguate an idea using ambiguous terms, and this is a problem. Another kind of problem that exists, and this is the metaphysical part of it, which unfortunately I won't be able to address much today, but I do want to point to it, which is, what is the ontological glue? How do all of these items that you list together actually fit together? If you think about, in the case of a helicopter, an engine, rotor, uh, tail rotor, the skids, right? You can think of these things, and there's a certain way in which it makes sense to say that a helicopter has all of these things. We understand how it all goes together. But how do capabilities and art go together? Or a symbol and a conception, or a community and a practice? In other words, if you look at these long conceptualizations, you see that they're not only ambiguous in relation to each other, but often they belong to separate logical categories, right? So a person and a practice. How do a person and a practice go together into a thing like a religion or a culture, such that you know that that is a thing that is actually supposed to be an object of study? And so basically the question is, are you dealing with a real bundle? In other words, do these things actually naturally go together? Is there an object in the world that it makes sense to study? Or is it just a jumble? What justifies placing all of these things together? And my claim again is that we know it when we see it. The scholar knows that these things are all supposed to go together, and there's good reasons to suppose that they go together. But as a theoretical matter, um, there's really no, as I say, ontological glue that allows us to say, yes, these are all different aspects of a single reality that it makes sense to theorize. Again, is it a bundle or is it just a jumble? And so I argue in the book at more length, but basically that you want to avoid three different kinds of problems when you're conceptualizing a reality like one of these metaphysical institutions. One, it shouldn't be overly simple and hence analytically weak. Two, the definitions need to exclude the right things and they should not exclude the right things or include the wrong things, and you should avoid these hodgepodge definitions that bundle together logically disparate features, meaning that they seem to belong to different kinds of beings, different kinds of realities. And the idea and the goal should be a conceptualization that is complex, but is also coherent, and that also has the right scope, that also is trying to get at the right things. All right. So how do we do this? If we jump in and begin to try to theorize institutions, one of the important ideas here is this notion, or this, what you could call a conceptual space of shared thinking. Now, what do we mean by shared thinking here? So there's everything that you can think about on one's own, what you perceive, remember, reason, and love, and appreciate, and so forth. But then there are the forms of thinking, the expressions that exist between people and that we share and that gets passed down from generation to generation, and that also gets communicated and shared between human beings in this institutional setting. And so this is that if we use a first person metaphor, this is the difference between I know and we know, or between I understand and we understand. And often if one says that I saw something, it has to do with one's own personal. It's not an institutional statement. But if we say, for example, we know that the sun is 93 million miles away from the Earth, this is a shared thinking statement. You may or may not really know that on your own, but we, in some appropriate institution, know that that's the case. So that's what I mean here by shared thinking. Okay. Now, in order to get at my conception of an institution, in a sense, you really just have to jump right into the middle of it. And what I'm going to be offering is three sort of simpler definitions of the institution, which I'm then going to combine into a larger conception. But let's begin, let's just jump right in and say, in the first case, definition 1 of 3, an institution is an instance of shared thinking in a relationship of community, practice, and legacy. Community, practice, and legacy. Now, what do I mean by this? A community is the group of people defined by being those who know the right things, they know the right things, and they do things the right way. The practice is defined by inheriting and bequeathing the right things, or the right knowledge, really. And that inheriting and that bequeathing is carried out by the right people. Finally, legacy is that which is bequeathed and inherited in the practice by that right group of people who are doing things the right way. Now, this is a little bit abstract. It's a little bit general. Let's give a specific example. You can use the institution of modern science, right? So in this case, the community would be what we usually call the scientific community. The practicing scientists, the people who, run the various research laboratories, etc. Right? So you have the people who we trust, or who are trusted, who have the moral authority to do things the right way, right? The practice is what we would call the scientific method. In other words, doing things, broadly speaking, scientifically. Scientifically. How do we know if something is scientific in its method? How do we know something is being done scientifically? It's done by the right people. And it's also basing itself on the right knowledge. And it's producing the right kind of knowledge, which is the legacy. That here, instead of not scientific community or scientific method, but here you have scientific knowledge, the knowledge that's given by science, the understanding that's bequeathed and inherited by scientists doing things scientifically. So you have this kind of triadic relationship, the scientific community, the scientific practice, doing things scientifically, and the knowledge that it's done. And what's interesting about these is that these three exist in a certain kind of logical relationship to each other. That is to say, they're mutually irreducible, they're mutually distinct, and they're mutually implicative. That is to say, you cannot reduce scientific method to, let's say, the people and the knowledge that they have, right? You cannot reduce any one of those elements of the triad to the other two, or to make them all really aspects of one. You have to have all three, but they're distinct from each other. They're not really easily confused from one another, and they imply one another, right? So not only can you not reduce one to the other, but you always find in the presence of one, you always find the other two, right? So you have these three, right? The three terms are necessary to cover the conceptual space. They don't conceptually overlap, and they presuppose and imply each other. And when I get to the metaphysical sections of the book, these principles come back, and I talk about them in some more detail. Let's jump to a second definition. Right now, we have a kind of a simple conception of what is an institution. It's an instance of shared thinking. There's a community, there's a practice, there's a legacy. Okay, let's set that aside for a second. Now we have another conception of institution. It's an instance of shared thinking characterized by stability, dynamism, and purpose, right? So an institution is always going to have a kind of a stability over time and over space, right? So it's going to be the same here as over there, but also now and later, meaning it's remembered, communicated, it's accessible. It's always going to have dynamism, meaning institutions also have to be places of creativity, of newness, of adaptation, right? Where things are intelligible in different contexts. And then also, an institution always has some kind of purpose. There's always a for what. For example, in the case of colleges and universities, you have a mission statement. Sometimes that mission statement is explicit, and people hammer it out over years. Sometimes it's implicit, right? But there is a sense of what the institution exists for. And similar to the question of to community, practice, and legacy, if we look at it, stability, dynamism, and purpose in the context of an institution also imply one another. They're also not reducible to each other, and they're distinct from one another. So they also have those same three principles that are, exist. So in the case, again, let's use the case of modern science again. Stability means that there's a certain sameness. Modern science doesn't change every minute, but it has a dynamism because without change, it would sort of cease to be what it is. And then it has purpose in the sense that scientists know what they're doing, what their institution exists for. Let's say the expansion of human knowledge or the betterment of the conditions of human beings. These are not necessarily unanimous, but you get the idea. Okay. Now, what happens is that you can take both of these conceptions and combine them. And what happens when you take an institution as a community practice and legacy, but characterized by stability, dynamism, and purpose? You get a list of 6 things. But it's not just a list because those logical characteristics of the terms of the definition being implicative of each other, of being distinct conceptually from each other, and also being irreducible to each other, can be, as it were, multiplied by each other. That is to say, rather than simply having a list, those same logical principles are able to arise. In a sense, what happens is you can take the first triad and cross it with the other triad, and you get a new set of concepts. And you can speak of an institution in terms of these 9 terms, where you say that an institution always has to have a memory, human beings remembering and perceiving. There's always mastery by this community, human beings and their ability to reason and imagine, and then human beings who judge and who care for the institution. When you combine stability with practice, you get the idea that institutions always have a communicative aspect of it to them, a creative aspect, a corrective aspect. And that when you combine legacy with these 3 elements of stability, dynamism, and purpose, we get the idea that there are always things, let's say aspects of knowledge or of an inheritance that are available across time and space, that are intelligible and adaptable, and that are valued and promoted. And so one can spend a long time on each of these items. But the idea here being that just as community practice and legacy has those logical relationships to each other, the same applies for these 9 items. That is to say, memory, mastery, and moral authority, being communicative, creative, and corrective, being available, intelligible, and valuable. These 9 elements of the institution are not reducible. One is not reducible to any of the others. They all imply one another, and they're distinct conceptually from each other. There's really no confusing these from each other. Now, let's move to the third definition here, which is an institution as an instance of shared thinking constituted by certain accounts, heuristics, and norms. Now, I'm using these as technical terms here. So let's quickly say something about that. An account includes descriptions, representations, facts, premises, acts. Essentially, the idea of an institution's know that which is known, right? Givens, let's say. A heuristic refers not so much to something that is a given or an axiom, but what in mathematics would be called a theorem. That is to say, it's a kind of a method, a template, a guideline, a technique, right? A certain how to do things, right? If you have X, how do you get to Y, right? A kind of an if-then formalism. So a heuristic is an institution's know-how. And the norm would be a technical term that includes values and standards and purposes and so forth and so on. And here I'm using this kind of funny term, an institution's know why, right? What's the knowledge of that which is good and purposeful and so forth. Now, my claim, and this really gets a little bit more complex, is that if you then add, in other words, what is it? You could ask, going back to this, what is it that human beings remember and perceive? What is it that they reason and imagine? What is regulated? What is promoted and valued? What is intelligible? It's these things, the accounts, the heuristics, and the norms. And then you can add that into the conception, and you can say that you have, for example, human beings judging and caring for shared accounts, heuristics, and norms. This So for example, human beings judging and caring for shared accounts is one thing. For shared heuristics is another. Shared norms is yet another. And you wind up getting, and it's hard to show here, and it takes up a few pages in the book, you have a 27-dimensional picture. And the claim that I'm making is that even when you have 27 elements, 27 parameters, you might say, of defining institution, because of the way the model is constructed, you're still able to have these various elements be irreducible to each other, be conceptually distinct from each other, and then also be implicative of each other, right? And they all kind of build up. And so what you get, ultimately, you get this definition, which seems long and complicated, but when analyzed, winds up having it not falling into the errors that I mentioned the previous definitions fall prey to. So the summative definition of an institution is an instance of shared thinking in a relationship of community practice and legacy, characterized by stability, dynamism, and purpose, and constituted by accounts, heuristics, and norms. And as far as metaphysical institutions, you could say, as a specific instance of this, a culture, civilization, religion, and tradition, or tradition, is an instance of shared thinking with respect to ultimate questions. So it's a certain kind of institution existing in that same, right? Again, those same nine elements. Now, I want to quickly mention and not spend as much time discussing that those 9 elements, these 9 concepts, which can then be combined in such a way as to produce these 27 parameters. That's the necessary aspect of an institution, right? Any institution is going to have those, whether it's a club or it's a religion, right? It's going to have these in one way or another. However, as we know, institutions all have different features from each other, and different institutions don't manifest in the same way. So there's always going to be an empirical variability within these parameters. So for example, again, I'm going to go through this quickly, but within the context, the parameter of community, you can have different kinds of hierarchy. Within practice, you can have a certain balance between the old and the new. Within legacy, you can talk about the modality or the substrate, right? The media by which the legacy is bequeathed, right? Is it books? Is it embodied practice? Is it online? So forth and so on. Again, with stability, you can have this balance between longevity and resilience, on dynamism and purpose. Again, so let's move through this quickly because I don't want to run out of time. And here, when it comes to the accounts, the heuristics, and the norms, it's a question of the balance between showing and telling, or let's say between imaginative versus rational, or between let's say imitation versus instruction through a language. And that's a complex area, but I just want to mention that that's also part of the empirical variability. It's also important to mention that which exists on the outside of institutions. That is to say, you want to be careful of establishing, first of all, the necessary parameters of an institution. That was talking about that, community practice and legacy, etc. But then what about those realities which we encounter, which are close or kind of near neighbors of institutions, but which don't qualify as an institution? We want to be able to make sure that we're not mislabeling things, right? We don't want to call something that's not an institution or the reverse. In the case of community, when a community becomes disconnected from a practice and a legacy, you really have just an identity, right? Identity and community are not the same thing. This is especially important in the case of religion, right? Is a religion a question of identity, which doesn't place any moral, intellectual conditions on the people, or is it a community which does? In the case of practice, when practice is disconnected from the things that presuppose it, you get a mere routine. A legacy that's detached from its community and its practice becomes a kind of an heirloom or a relic. Stability, again, outside of an institutional situation, a true institution, becomes ossification. Dynamism becomes plasticity, right? Or hoarding, it just becomes kind of endless, meaningless activity. And purpose becomes something like just mere interests, right? It's kind of impulses or just incentives. And finally, an account outside of its proper context is not really an account in that proper sense, but it's just an assertion or a demand, or it's just an assertion or a claim, a bare claim. heuristics become reflexes, and norms become, you might say, demands, right? And what I'm speaking about in so when instead of community, you get identity, instead of practice, you get routine. The idea here is that in order to be able to talk about something properly as an institution, there's a kind of a wholeness to it. And if you rip apart or fragment that wholeness, you actually wind up talking about different things. That doesn't mean, by the way, I should be clear, that identity is a bad thing, or routine, or none of these are per se bad things. But they do disqualify a given practice, idea, or person from being, let's say, part of that institutional context. Uh, this this is just an example. I mean, I won't spend time talking about it. In the book, I use a language analogy, and it's a kind of a portrait of the way that you can use this model as applied to the English language. All right, these are the 27 elements. I also do it in the case of modern medicine, but again, these are things which we can talk about at some. It has to be not for this lecture. All right. Finally, just as a kind of a conclusion, the book ends with a conclusion whose name is, it's the sighted men and the elephant. And now we all know about the parable of the blind men and the elephant, which is that there are these men who cannot see what it is that they're touching. One of them touches the trunk, thinks it's a snake. One touches the leg and thinks it's a tree. One of them touches its ear and thinks it's something else. One of them touches the tail and thinks it's a there's a few different versions of this idea. And so I put a little bit of a twist on it and said, let's imagine a parable here, a kind of an allegory where it's sighted men, people who know have experience with elephants. And that's us. Like, we all have experience, quote unquote, elephants, meaning metaphysical institution. And what the rubric can do is give us these, you might say, heuristics, or ability to do three important things, which is this idea of defragmenting, disambiguating, and metaphysics. A kind of, and I'm going to describe what this. So by defragmentation, what I mean is, we know as people who have seen and have experience with elephants, that trunks and tusks and flappy ears and tree-like legs always go together. And so if you have a complex, nuanced, theoretically strong model of a metaphysical institution, whether you call it religion or culture or civilization, what it enables you to do is to know that when you run into one aspect of an institution, it gives you a heuristic or a mnemonic, a way of remembering that the other elements are also there and present, right? That's, I think, that's an important part of what a good theory should do. It should give you a sense of the whole and allow you to focus on the particular. In the case of what I'm calling disambiguation, when we refer to something as religious or uh, or so in the case of elephantine, the idea is that this is meant to be kind of like, what does it mean to call something elephantine? Are you talking about size? Are you talking about good memory? Are you talking about loudness, right? There's different words that can be used for that. And then finally, in the case of metaphysics, the sighted people have to presuppose something, and they have to know something about what an elephant actually is, right? What is an elephant? What is it capable of? What makes a good elephant? And so, again, in the case of defragmentation, using the analogy, to see particular objects of study as aspects of larger institutional realities. In the case of disambiguation, being aware of the fact that modifiers like religious and cultural are idioms that encompass many irreducibly complex realities. And then metaphysics, it's the role of ultimate assumptions. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to discuss this much today, but one of the claims I argue in the book is that, questions like what is a human being, what is rational, and what is good really determine what gets categorized as culture as opposed to tradition, for example. In other words, in the case of Islam, for example, why is it that some things are called religious and some things are called cultural? It really comes down to one's ultimate metaphysical assumptions, even if you're not aware of what those are, which cause you to place the good things that you like into favored categories. Perhaps you favor the culture category as being a good thing, but the categories of religion and culture might be unfavored categories in your case. That's a very complicated area, but I did want to mention that this is also part of the model. And that's my presentation. It's too bad that I can't take any questions, but I'm very honored to have been invited to give this lecture. I'd like to thank my colleague Mohammed Rustam and his colleagues there for inviting me. And thank you very much for the happy occasion. Take care.